did we receive the Bible?
You know, how did the Bible come down to us? What is this thing, Scripture? And even further than that, you go back and you say, look, you had Jesus and you had the Old Testament, and Jesus and the Jewish people thought you got the canon of the Old Testament, the books of the Old Testament. Where do the letters of the apostles and their books, when did the first Christians after Jesus start thinking, you know what, Paul's letters, Peter's letters, John's book, Luke, this is Scripture equal in weight with the Old Testament Scripture. Now, folks, right here, critical scholars, university professors load up with all kinds of ideas of what happened after Jesus and what you ought to do with this information we call the 27 books of the New Testament. Darrell, tell me a few of the ideas that are being floated out there by the critics.
Well, what's basically discussed in relation to the canon is a political process on the university campus where a certain group selected certain books that reflected their theology and their wing of the church, the way they put it. Remember that for a critical scholar, for many of them, there are alternative kinds of Christianities in the early centuries. And they built this Scripture as kind of a fort to support their orthodoxy. And this process usually begins to be attributed to Irenaeus in the end of the 2nd century, although more popularly, most people are familiar with the argument as Dan Brown formulated it, which is that it was a result of the creeds that came out in the late 4th century and in the 5th century. So obviously a much later process, obviously politically motivated with an agenda to crush the alternatives, that kind of thing. So it's part of a huge political battle. And what they'll point to, remember what we're talking about here are elements of the history that are pointed out and then it's given a certain twist. What they'll point to is you don't see the gospel writers citing one another directly earlier. You don't even see in the early 2nd century the New Testament being talked about as a concept. What you're getting is Paul said this or a gospel said that. And in any given work in the 2nd century, you might see one or two of the gospels, you might see one or two of the epistles of Paul. There's nothing like a, pulled together 27 books of the Bible functioning in that period. So I like to joke that, how did you teach theology in the church, in a Bible church, before there was a Bible for the church? That's the situation that you're in. And so what happens is that they argue there's this political process. And so the question becomes, where did a scriptural consciousness come from? And then what was the process by which these books began to rise to the top? Well, what we see is these letters, some of them are being read in the churches as they're being written and circulated. Paul talks about reading certain of his letters in the churches. There's a respect for what it is that Paul's writing. Paul even issues an anathema on certain people for the nature of the teaching that he's given and for the nature of the material that he's writing if it's not heeded, that kind of thing.